It is a bit hard not to notice that our society is confused about gender, and even more generally, confused about who we are as humans, including who we are as male and female. Even Christians and churches are confused. So confused that they are creating another mankind, other than revealed in Genesis 1 and 2, and because, as we shall see, mankind images God, then they are creating another God of their imaginations. As you know, our church has been independent, and we are seeking to renew our links with the New South Wales Baptist Association of Churches. However, the association has been in the headlines over the past week. They voted, correctly I believe, to disaffiliate two churches who would not agree to their statement on marriage. Here is how it was reported on the ABC Internet News. This is what the ABC News said. The New South Wales Baptist Association reviewed its constitution in 2022 and reaffirmed its position that marriage was between one man and one woman, as ordained by God. But the Canberra congregation stood by a differing view, that marriage is a matter for each individual to decide, according to their own conscience. We believe very much that we have freedom of conscience, Canberra Baptist Church pastor Belinda Groves said. We can read the Bible really thoughtfully and faithfully, and we can come to different conclusions, and that's okay. For our church, we can have people here who have a very traditional view of marriage, and then we have people who are very open to having same-sex couples and couples in de facto relationships as part of the church. As I said, I see it as a good thing that the association did this, expelling Canberra and Hamilton churches. The association has rightly realized that our understanding of how we are created is fundamental to how we relate to God, of whether or not we are truly living out a life of reconciliation to God, reflecting who God is in our lives. Now, I want to read to you a testimony of a Christian lady who has come to the opposite conclusion than those two churches. Her name is Rosaria Butterfield.
20 years ago, I lived as a lesbian. I delighted in my lover, our home on one of the Finger Lakes, our golden retrievers, and our careers. When Christ claimed me for his own, I did not stop feeling like a lesbian. I did not fall out of love with women. I was not converted out of homosexuality. I was converted out of unbelief. Conversion to Christ did not initially change my sexual attraction for women. What conversion did change immediately was my heart and mind. My mind was on fire for the Bible, and I could not read enough of it or enough about it. Break time, but the gospel gave me a light that was ruinous. It ruined me for the life I had loved. The Lord's light illumined my sin through the law and illumined my hope through Jesus and the gospel. The gospel destroyed me before the Lord built me back up. In saying yes to Jesus and no to the desires of my flesh, I learned that the only way to peace with my God was through the cross, the one that Jesus died on and the one that I was called, with the help of Jesus, to carry.
Today's sermon is on Genesis 2, about how and why God created humans, and it is about them being created male and female, as 127 says. It is about being the image of God. It is not about our each individually deciding how God has made mankind, but about how God has made us as the image of God, or more accurately, how God has made Adam the image of God. Now we have to start back in Gen 1 to understand Genesis 2. Genesis 1:26 says, "And God said, Let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion." This is God telling us what He is about to do. Now, it seems to be about the creation of mankind, and that is how nearly all the versions translate the Hebrew word Ardarm. And God said, Let us make Ardarm in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion. Now, let's read it again, so you can see where they translate Ardarm as mankind. And God said, Let us make mankind in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion. And as you read through Genesis 1 for the first time, that is a proper way to take Ardarm as mankind. But as you work your way through chapters 2 to 5, you should be having doubts that Ardarm in chapter 1 is solely and primarily referencing mankind. Yes, mankind is the end point, but is it the genesis, the beginning point of being the image of God? The first thing to note is that at times the Bible uses word plays. The word Ardarm actually has multiple meanings. It can mean a man, and it can mean mankind, and it can mean the name Adam. Also, it is from the same base word for ground, Ardarm-ah. And as we will see in Genesis 2:7, that man is formed from the dust of the ground, of the dust of the Ardarmah. So we have Ardarm from Ardarmah. There is a lot of wordplay going on. And this includes, is it a man, or is it mankind, or is it Adam? I want to argue that it is all three, for God says in verse 26 that He is going to make a man from whom all mankind will come, and as we go through the story right through to Genesis 5, where we are specifically told that Genesis 1:26 is actually about the real historical man, Adam, from whom all mankind comes. So yes, it is about mankind, as we read through the first time. But as we read further, we find out that it is the real historical man, Adam, from whom mankind comes. This is important in understanding what is meant by the image of God. By only translating Ardarm as man or mankind, the versions are saying that mankind is the image of God, whereas the whole story ends up telling us that it is Adam who is the image of God. And likewise, verse 27 also tells us that it is about him when it says, "In the image of God He created him." Only reading it as mankind, and primarily reading it as mankind, opens the door for us to insert our own current definition of mankind into our understanding of the image of God, of who mankind is, rather than understanding who mankind is through Adam. And so, back to our opening thoughts. This is what was said there. But the Canberra congregation stood by a differing view, that marriage is a matter for each individual to decide according to their own conscience. "We believe very much that we have freedom of conscience," Canberra Baptist Church pastor Belinda Grove said. "We can read the Bible really thoughtfully and faithfully, and we can come to different conclusions, and that's okay." This points to the basic problem. They have their own, they think, that we can each have our own definition of mankind. However, I am arguing that Genesis tells us that it is Adam who is the image of God, and not our various definitions of who we want mankind to be. The other church, which was disaffiliated, one of the pastors, had this to say about Genesis 2. The emphasis in the Genesis 2 story is not upon the distinctive orientation of marriage towards the bearing and nurture of children, nor upon the biological duality or any other duality of men and women. Rather, the reason for marriage is that we find another who is just like us, i.e., human, with whom we can share life and its tasks. Marriage throughout the Bible is built around this kernel. It goes all sorts of places we today reject: polygamy, levir marriage, taking wives as the bounty of war, the subordination of women to men. But it also provides us with this glimpse of possibility that marriage can be that relationship in which we find delight and bonds of unity. So this pastor has his own definition of marriage, and so of mankind, and it includes any sort of coupling of humans irrespective of gender, as long as in it we find delight and a bond of unity. This is what is being done: redefining mankind. It is doing so without recourse to Adam, who we are told in Genesis 1 is the image of God. And so, as they redefine mankind, they are simultaneously redefining God. So, today, I only want to do two things. I want to show you that Genesis 2 is telling us how Ardarm is the image of God. Genesis 2 tells us about the forming of Adam from the ground and the building of woman Eve out of Adam. The image of God is defined in the story of these two persons, and it does so in a certain specific way. Secondly, I want to briefly look at Genesis 5 and the genealogy of Adam to see how it comments and explains Genesis 1:26-27. Now back to Genesis 1. As I said, verse 26 is about the proposal to create Adam, which in its basic sense is the proposal to create a man. And verse 27 is about the actual creation of the Ardarm. So verse 26 says Ardarm, and verse 27 says Ha-Ardarm, where Ha is the word the. So in verse 26, God proposes to make a man, and in verse 27, God actually makes that man. Now, when we come to Genesis 2, we get this exact same pattern of the yet-to-be-created Ardarm, a man, where in verse 5 it says, there was no Ardarm to work the Ardarm the ground, and in verse 7 it says, God formed Ha-Ardarm, the man, of dust from the Ardarm the ground. So, chapter 2 parallels chapter 1, in moving from the yet-to-be-created, a man, and then to the actually created, the man. So Genesis 2 is an expansion of Genesis 1. Now Genesis 1:27 also refers to Ha-Ardarm, the man, with the personal pronoun him, which indicates it is a specific man it is referring to. However, and this is where it gets a bit tricky, in Genesis 1 there is not only mention of a man and the man and him, but also of them in verse 26 and 27, and male and female in verse 27. So somehow it has gone from the singular a man and him being the image of God to including the plural male and female. And that is why the translators opt for mankind, because of the words them and male and female. But somewhat confusingly, the verses also use the singular a man and the singular him. I call this the singular plural conundrum. And then the story of Genesis 2 and up to Genesis 5 is not so simple as to be just about corporate mankind. It is actually, for most of those chapters, telling us about Ha-Ardarm, the man. In fact, every mention from 2:7 up to 4:25 is Ha-Ardarm, the man. And Ha-Ardarm does not ever mean mankind. It is only Ardarm that can mean mankind. It never says Ardarm without the article the in these chapters. And then, when we get to Genesis 5, with the genealogy of Adam, we actually find out that we have been reading a whodunit, where the solution is given in Adam's genealogy in chapter 5, verses 1 to 5. Now, let me read to you a description of a whodunit. A typical whodunit story presents a crime or conundrum of some sort right at the start. From there, an astute investigator, either amateur or professional, is called in to solve the case. We as readers are presented with all of the clues just as the characters in the story see them, which means we have all the tools to crack the case along with our main character. A good whodunit story offers up a mystery like a puzzle that is complicated to solve, but not impossible. In the end, we as readers might not have been able to figure out the culprit of the case before our gifted investigator did so. But looking back, we realize we had all the puzzle pieces to fit the case together. And so when we reread the story, we read it with understanding. We can see who the culprit is, right from the very start. This is what is happening in Genesis 1 to 5. Is it a man, or mankind, or Adam? Genesis 5 tells us it is Adam. And so, as we reread the chapters, we see it is Adam all along, who is the image of God who defines man and mankind. So, let's have a brief look at that, where the solution to the identity of Ardarm is revealed in Genesis 5. Now remember, I said that it was Ha-Ardarm, the man, all the way to 425, where it then becomes Ardarm again. And Ardarm knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth. Even in 4:1, where it is also about him becoming a father, it is Ha-Ardarm, the man. Why the sudden switch from Ha-Ardarm, the man, to the personal name Ardarm Adam after 3 chapters of Ha-Ardarm? The answer is simple. After his son Cain is born, the man is now not the only man alive. So his name can no longer be the man, Ha-Ardarm. So it switches to Ardarm Adam from then on and into the chapter 5 genealogy. So let's read Genesis 5. This is the book of the generations of Ardarm. When God created Ardarm, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female he created them, and he blessed them and named them Ardarm when they were created. When Ardarm had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness, after his image, and named him Seth. The days of Ardarm after he fathered Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days that Ardarm lived were 930 years, and he died. In this passage, all 6 references are the word Ardarm, just like in chapter 1, verse 26. So, is it a man, mankind, or Adam? This passage, Genesis 5, is clearly about the real historical man Adam of 425 who has just begotten a son, because it is his genealogy. It is about him and his descendants. Now, logic would tell you that the 6 references should all be translated the same way. But no, the translators use man or mankind for the middle 2. Let me show you from the ESV. This is the book of the generations of Adam. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female he created them, and he blessed them and named them man when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness, after his image, and named him Seth. The days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. So, can you see where they have translated Adam as man, mankind? They do this because that is what they translated Ardarm in chapter 1, where they had not taken into account what is read here and in chapters 2 to 4, where we find out that it is Adam all along. The author gives the solution to the whodunit in Genesis 5, but our translators ignore that. Also, I want you to note that in the sentences where they translate as man, mankind, there is right smack in the middle of those sentences the pronoun him. When God created man, mankind, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female he created them, and he blessed them and named them man, mankind when they were created. If the genealogy is about Adam, which it is in the surrounding verses 1a and 3, 4, and 5, then the him must be Adam. This passage is clearly telling us when God created Adam, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female he created them, and he blessed them and named them Adam when they were created. That is, it is telling us how to read and translate Ardarm of Genesis 1. The context of the genealogy tells us that it is Adam who is the image of God. And this is reinforced in the next sentence in verse 2 when it says he named them Ardarm when they were created. Genesis 5 also tells us that there was a naming going in Genesis 1, even though when you read Genesis 1 the term or action of naming is not actually mentioned. Genesis 5:2 says, he names them Adam. So Genesis 5 is giving us an interpretation of Genesis 1. It is telling us how to read Genesis 1. It is giving us the solution to the whodunit of what is meant by Ardarm. Ultimately and primarily, Ardarm is Adam, for Adam is the man through whom comes mankind. And so we are to read Ardarm as Adam, in both Genesis 5 and Genesis 1. As we reread Genesis 1 for a second and third time, we are to do so knowing the solution to the whodunit. It is Adam who is the image of God. But you might say, that doesn't make sense because it mentions them and male and female just like Genesis 1 did. So back to Genesis 1. How can a man, the man Adam who is the image of God, be both a him and a them? How can a him be male and female? The answer is to be found in the story in Genesis 2, and specifically that woman is built out of man. Now before we look at that, let's remember the context of the making of man. The previous verses are about the making of the animals. It is in this context that, as I said last week, God uses more personal language to describe the making of man. For the animals it is, let the earth bring forth, but for man it is, let us make, in our image. Personal language for the making of persons, as opposed to the making of animals. The making of man is somehow about the making of persons. Yet, in chapter 2, verse 7, God does not make persons plural. He only makes the man. Immediately you should ask yourself, how can the man be a person without any other person? There is something strange going on in this story, and besides, Genesis 1 already told us there would be persons. So, let's have a close look in Genesis 2 at what it says about the man God forms. It starts off with him being just like the animals, like how animals are made. He is from the ground, and he has life breathed into him, a living creature, just like the animals, when they are created, will have the breath of life and will be living creatures. Now a side point. In Genesis 1, weren't the animals created before man, but in Genesis 2, and after Adam and before woman? Now, the translators try and get around this in Genesis 2, verse 19, by adding in the word had to say, had formed. So this would get around the problem. However, I contend that the creation of animals after the man and before the woman is correct, and that it is incorrect to assume an order in Genesis 1. In the original Hebrew, verse 24 says, and God said, let the earth, and verse 26 says, and God said, let us make. That is, it is the same words, and God said, in both. Verse 26 does not have the time sequence word then. That is a mistranslation, an unwarranted addition in the English. The King James Version has it correct this time. It says, and God said for verse 26. So within day 6 of creation is not necessarily giving us the time sequence of events listed as happening on day 6 in verses 24 to 26. Also, to be noted that, as I said before, Verse 26 is about the yet-to-be-created Ardam. That is, it is telling you of God's intent, not of the actual creation of Adam. It is verse 27 that tells you of the actual creation, and even there we must look to Genesis 2 to find out the time sequence of how God creates the man, the him, as the image of God as male and female. Them. Let me read it to you in verse 27, with a bit of explanation as I go along. So God created the man in his own image. And then it is repeated in reverse order, that it is the man by using the word him. In the image of God he created him. Then it expands how he created as the image of God. Male and female he created them. It is Genesis 2 that tells us how we get from the him, from just the man, to the male and female them. Next, in Genesis 2, God makes a special garden for him, and it is there he is placed. There seems to be something special about this breathing creature from the ground. And then he is given a job to do in the garden and with the garden, to work it and keep it. This is something we will never be told that about the animals once they are created. And then God starts talking to the man as if he is not just a creature but a person like God. And God holds the man responsible for what he does, unlike the animals will not be. So he seems to be a very special, even glorious type of breathing creature. Yet when the animals are created, he is less than the animals, for it is only him. Only one. The animals, when they are presumably made in pairs, male and female, each of the pair presumably being individually made from the ground. But it seems as if God has forgotten something when he makes the man and the animals. There is not another someone to be found amongst the animals. But sorry, I am jumping ahead. For God has already concurred in verse 18 that there is something missing, someone missing. It is not good that the man should be alone. It is not good? But everything in chapter 1 was good. Now it is not good. This is a description of man uncompleted, man alone, man without woman. It is the expression of the singular, plural conundrum. It is the referring to the chasm in verse 27 between, so God created the man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, and between male and female he created them. This conundrum had already pointed to God's assessment. It is not good that the man should be alone. But why didn't God just make the woman at the same time that he made the man? And why didn't God just make the animals at the same time? Why not make all the breathing living creatures, male and female, animals and mankind, all at the same time? Why didn't he make man and woman both out of the ground, like the animal male and female presumably are? God then makes the animals from the ground, presumably as male and female, and brings them to the man. Maybe now, in God making the animal living creatures, he has made a spare one, a female living creature that did not have a partner. Maybe he was just keeping the man in suspense. Maybe woman will be found there. So, Adam carefully, you can imagine how very carefully, examines each one, so carefully does he analyze them, that he is able to give each animal an appropriate name. But, on examining and naming each animal, there was not a spare female, who was like him and different to the other animals. It would, at this point, be an obvious conclusion that Adam is different to the other living creatures. But for now he is different, because he is alone. He does not have a female partner that corresponds to him. In not having found a female partner amongst the animals, Adam has found out that besides his not being completed, that he is not an animal. But what if Adam had found Eve amongst the animals? Then it could only be because she was an animal. And if she was found amongst the animals and corresponded to Adam, then that would imply that Adam himself, though glorious and seemingly a person, was in fact not a person, but only an intelligent, glorious animal. And as we know, Adam was made from the ground just like the animals. Adam was a living being just like the animals. If Eve had been made from the ground just like the animals, then they, Adam and Eve, were really just animals and not the image of God. Yes, they both, Adam and Eve, would have been glorious, each in their own unique way, each highly intelligent, but unfortunately, each just an animal, neither nor both the image of God. Each would have been equally made by God, each of the same substance, the ground. Equal in this respect, each able to use their intelligence to fulfill the mandate to be in dominion over the other animals, but still, they would only be animals. This is, I propose, is the dominant view of mankind that we have today. Each of us, individuals, whether male or female, whether cis or trans, each individually their own self-proclaimed image of God, each able to decide who they are, including whether they are male or female or whatever, no matter, for what matters is that they are able to choose who they are. Yes, all equal, for we are all from the same batch of chemicals, just matter, each able to use their strength and intelligence to get what they desire, to be what they desire. It is we who define mankind, not God, not the image of God in Adam. And the strongest animal, whether that strength be in brute force or guile, will have their way. But Eve was not found amongst the animals. And so we all know the rest of the story, that God builds her. Yes, that is the word, built, from out of Adam. She is not made from the ground. So, she cannot be an animal. She was the only living, breathing creature that God did not make from the ground. She is God's special make, a one-off. And she is not a rival to Adam, for she is part of him. This is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She is not another male, not another Adam, for he was formed from the ground. She is different to him. She is not a clone of him. She is female and he is male, just as Genesis 1:27 said it would be. And she is what completes him, as the image of God. Without her being built out of him, Adam would not be completed as the image of God. Adam would not be the image of God. Without her being built out of him, he is only a very intelligent animal. And woman, independent of being built out of Adam, is not the image of God. She too is only a very intelligent animal. And she is not another image of God, for he was formed from the ground and she is not. If she was formed out of the ground as another image of God, then there would have been two images of God. A male image of God and a female image of God. Two competing images of God. But it is Adam who is the image of God. But he is not so without Eve, for she completes him as the image of God. And she is not a competing image of God, for she is built out of him. As I said above, Adam is the image of God, is not the dominant view of mankind we have today. Rather, our dominant view of mankind, of male and female, is of equally being the separate image of God in our own right. Each made by God, separately and equally made in his image, as if we were made from separate pieces of the ground, just like the animal male and female were made. And, each being separately made, then we can define ourselves as we like, not even restricted to the male and female. Paul in 1 Cor 11 describes woman as the glory of man. Without her being built out of him, then he was incomplete, only a very intelligent and glorious animal, but not the image of God. No wonder Paul says that woman is the glory of man. She is most precious and valuable, for she is what makes him what he is, the image of God. What a glorious special make she is. Now that is all for today. You have lots to think about. You need to read through Genesis 1 and 2 and up to chapter 5 and think about what I have said to see if it is true. Let's conclude in prayer. Heavenly Father, you have made us all from that one man, Adam. Even Eve was built from him. Thank you that in doing so, you have made us persons, just like you are an eternal person, along with your Son and the Holy Spirit. Please forgive us in our defining mankind and ourselves as we want, rather than as you have made us. Thank you that in coming to know your Son, our Lord Jesus, we have come to know you and your Holy Spirit is restoring us back into your image. Amen.